The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a period of political upheaval that saw the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of a new socio-economic and political frontier, the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. In 1894, Tsar Nicholas II ascended to the throne. Liberal politicians, enlightened by radical ideas, wanted to abolish the absolute monarchy. The long-growing economic and political discontent in Russia provided revolutionary groups with a bed of support that could be used for change. Russia had gone through a series of uprisings and retaliations that led to the formation of a more democratic system of government that included the State Duma, the first national assembly in Russia's history where white men could vote. Other civil liberties were granted as well, such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, which would legalize workers' trade unions. The people were happy. This felt like a win. But the Tsar had powers over the Duma, allowing him to regain autocracy. When World War I broke out in 1914, Russia joined the Allied forces on the Eastern Front, and a wave of patriotism rushed through the country. Two alliances were pitted against one another, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. Soon, devastating defeats and mounting supply issues led to discontentment. The 6.5 million soldiers, mostly peasant farmers and factory workers, had only 4.6 million rifles. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II closed the Duma, declared himself commander-in-chief of the army, placed his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, in charge of the government, and departed for the Eastern Front. His absence left a weakened government, and hostility grew towards his unpopular German-born wife. Her close confidant was Grigory Rasputin, a Russian mystic and holy man from Siberia who was said to have magical powers to heal her son, the next heir to the throne, Alexei, from a deadly blood disorder known as hemophilia. Rasputin interfered in government affairs and made decisions on the Tsarina's behalf. Russians saw this as an example of the corrupt and out-of-touch ruling class. As the war dragged on, men died in the millions, and millions more deserted or were taken prisoner. Inflation rose and the economy became weak. The war effort strained the country's resources and led to widespread shortages and rationing, leaving women and children starving. A spontaneous uprising erupted on International Women's Day, February 23, 1917, in Russia's capital city, Petrograd. Thousands of women took to the streets to protest the food shortages and the high cost of living. They were joined the next day by workers, students, and soldiers, who turned the uprising into economic and political demonstrations and shut down the city's factories and transportation systems. The Tsar sent out 160,000 soldiers to crush the protests and order them to shoot, but they refused, and many of them joined their protests. The next day, the Tsar ordered the Duma to be dissolved, but they refused. Instead, they created a provisional committee and demanded that he abdicate his throne. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated and transferred power to his younger brother, Grand Duke Michael, but he refused. Tsar Nicholas was taken into custody, and for the next 5 months, he and his family were held at his home in Pushkin. And just like that, 1,000 years of autocracy, 300 years of the Romanov dynasty, and the last European absolute monarchy ended. These events became known as the February Revolution. Two separate authorities emerged, the Petrograd Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies and the Provisional Government. On March 13, 1917, factory workers began to organize into Soviets, councils elected to represent trade unions for fair and safe working conditions. They became a sort of parliament of Russian socialism. From the socialist revolutionaries, who believed in a democratic government to form a constitutional monarchy, to the Bolsheviks, the most radical faction who believed that a politically enlightened group of elites should lead the peasant masses. A provisional government was created of liberal and moderate socialist politicians, mostly from the Duma, and led by Alexander Kerensky. It was intended to be an interim government until a more permanent democratic parliament could be established. Elections were to be held after the war. They needed to work with the Soviets to create the foundation for a strong government and negotiated on several terms of reform. And to end the war, Vladimir Lenin, a leading figure in the Bolshevik Party, was living in Switzerland during the February Revolution and was desperate to get back to Russia to meet with the Petrograd Soviet. He wanted Russia to lose the war with the Central Powers so the Bolsheviks could take control of the government. Lenin had no respect for the provisional government or steady, slow, peaceful change. fueled by his hatred for the capitalist factory owners and the nobility, and a vision of an alternative world without social classes. He wanted quick, violent change that would start a worldwide revolution. He believed that the workers, together with the peasantry, must lead a revolution to get to the higher stages of economic and political evolution. Socialism, and finally communism. The German government agreed to help Lenin take power by giving him financial support and arranging for him and other Bolshevik leaders to travel through Germany, secretly in a sealed train. In return, Lenin provided the Germans with reports on Russia. Their master plan? To allow Lenin to overthrow the provisional government and destroy Russia from the inside. The provisional government was weak and couldn't solve the country's problems, and admitted they would continue to pursue their victory in the war. This was the provisional government's biggest problem. Once back in Russia, Lenin delivered his April thesis, a radical plan of insurrection. It called for immediate measure to build a socialist state, all power to the Soviets. But this plan was too radical, and Lenin was forced to flee. On July 1st, 1917, a mass demonstration was held at the capital by the Petrograd Soviet calling for an end to the war. This led to a complete, yet short-lived insurrection against the provisional government. The provisional government arrested Bolsheviks like Leon Trotsky, a skilled organizer and orator, and forced others like Lenin into disguise and hiding. They published documents in newspapers suggesting that Lenin was a German agent. They reorganized themselves and named Alexander Kerensky prime minister. These events are known as the July Days. On September 1st, 1917, Kerensky proclaimed Russia a republic and appointed General Kornilov as commander-in-chief of the army, hoping to turn the war and the country around. But he was soon dismissed, and Kornilov marched on Petrograd. In response, Kerensky released the Bolsheviks from prison and armed them to defend the capital. Kornilov was quickly arrested. These events became known as the Kornilov Revolt. On October 8th, Leon Trotsky became the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet and set up the Revolutionary Defense Committee. He directed the Petrograd garrison to defend the capital against the advancing Germans. This garrison became known as the Red Guard. Then Trotsky, along with Lenin, proposed an armed uprising against the provisional government, without much attempt at secrecy, but needed time to arrange the coup. Aware of this, Kerensky closed the Bolshevik newspaper and the city, and began to arrest Bolshevik leaders to stop the approaching insurrection. On October 24th, 1917, Trotsky ordered the Red Guards to seize key communication, transportation, and government buildings in Petrograd, including the Winter Palace, which was the seat of the provisional government. The following day, Kerensky escaped, but by midnight, the provisional government surrendered to the Red Guards and were arrested without bloodshed. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets transferred all government power to the Soviets of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies. The next day, the Congress elected a council of People's Commissars, a new provisional Soviet government with Lenin as chairman. Lenin arrested and imprisoned leaders from any party that was not Bolshevik, and confident that they would win, held the first ever free election of the people for the Russian Constituent Assembly. But the election results showed the Bolsheviks had lost the election by a landslide. The next day, in disgust, Lenin dissolved the assembly and seized control of Russia. These events are known as the October Revolution. What took place in the aftermath and leading up to the official formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 was a period of murder, civil war, terror, discrimination, and famine. A period of political infighting, land loss, and economic downfalls that set the stage for Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin. Yet, a new socio-economic and political frontier was forged, whose ideology spread and took root around the world and still exists today. The legacy of the Russian Revolution is a sad and complex one, of idealism, ignorance, desperation, and bloodshed. Others say it was a rise to greatness. Was Lenin a national hero or an unhinged madman? What would Russia look like today if Lenin had never intervened?